We now welcome Emmanuel Augustin, Vice President of Supply Management at Dubai Airports. Emmanuel will look at how organizations can prepare for a global slowdown, manage reduced cash flows, and change procurement goalposts perspectives.
Thank you very much, Rob. Good afternoon, everybody. First and foremost, I would like to thank Venture Connect for having me today. As Rob detailed, my intention today is to run you through a few activities that can be done eventually to support companies during the downturn and eventually with the recovery plan. So before I start eventually to deep into the procurement activities and eventually my perception, my view of how procurement and supply chain can support an organization, I would like to give you a bit of a background. I joined the aviation industry in February this year, and eventually this was the outlook of the aviation industry. So as you can see, the revenue per kilometer was growing across the board at the same pace as the GDP of the different countries. There was a good prospect, and the idea was that, you know, across the board, most of the airline will continue to grow, most of the airport will continue to generate revenue, and everything would be in a perfect world. To the point that, according to IATA, the target growth for the different market was ranging between 2.7, I'll say, and 5.8 for the Middle East between 2016 and 2036. So obviously, all positive, all good, everybody happy, as I can say, and people traveling the world, business travel continue to grow and so on. Then arrived what we know as the coronavirus. And between March and April this year, as you can see, the number of flights, of daily flights that we've seen across the world, whether it is in North America, Asia Pacific, Europe, has drastically reduced. And this is mainly linked to the fact that a lot of countries took some measures to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. So where does that leave us really as a procurement function? The first thing in order to understand that is really to understand what really matters for a company. So, you know, my former boss used to say that there are three things that matters for a company, and I'm sure he's laughing as he's probably on the call. The first one is growth, second is profit, and third one is cash generation. In the context of the pandemic, if you are Amazon, Zoom, or Microsoft, eventually you had a growth. You eventually had a profit, depending on how your CFO plays with the numbers, and your company probably generated cash. Now, if you're in the aviation industry, that's a bit of a different story. So as I showed you earlier, there was a massive drop in the number of flights, of daily flight across the board. And the expectations was really for a recovery of domestic flight in Q3 and progressively a recovery of international flight in Q4. We are seeing that, but still, if you look at it, the numbers looked really, really far below what they were in the past. So when you translate that into corporate numbers, really, you forget about growth. Your profit is likely to go down, and cash generation accordingly is likely to go down. So if you put yourself of a CPO or a chief supply chain officer, and you go in front of your CFO and try to understand what you should do, it's pretty much the same as asking yourself, how can I mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the company financials? Most of the people around this table and in the room are probably familiar with having discussions with CFO or managing directors when they say, yeah, but I don't see your savings in my P&L. So to start with, and what we have done and what I would have recommended everybody to do is to understand the financial structure also of the organization you work in. So, and what I mean by that is have a deep understanding of the operating expense structure, the asset profile, the financing need and methods. This is the only way eventually to get to a point where you can identify ways to generate savings and eventually free up cash flow. So two documents which are, there are three documents which are extremely important to understand as a procurement function, and that, to me, create an important link between procurement and finance is actually your P&L, your balance sheet, and your cash flow statements. And as a CPO, you need to go into these numbers and see what impact your spend profile has on these three documents. And this is the only way eventually to identify ways of generating P&L impacting savings and to free up cash flow. Once you've done that, that's what we did, we identified category strategies and inventory management plan that will help us to support the improvement that we wanted to make to the company P&L and balance sheet. So I'll stop for a minute on that because eventually, as procurement professionals, we need to focus on what are the key actions that we can take. So there are a few things that can be done in terms of category strategies. You can redesign your contract and include productivity clauses. So what I mean by productivity clauses is understand from the supplier how you can generate savings on the long run, whether it is through innovations, through economy of scales, or by introducing new elements into your contract. One of the strategies that I quite like is to adopt a TCO approach when it comes to the review of the contract terms. So I've seen a lot of contracts eventually across my career where eventually people were mainly focusing on the rates. A rate is just a price. And as procurement and supply chain professional, we should think about cost, but we should think about total cost. And the understanding of the total cost of ownership when we negotiate a contract is something that helps us eventually to optimize it in the best possible manner. One additional action that can be taken is actually to extend the payment terms. In the current climate, it's probably not the easiest things to do, considering that most of the suppliers will be under immense financial pressure. So one of the options that can be recommended is the introduction of trade finance through the concept of reverse factoring, whereby you offer the supplier to be paid in advance against a discount, and that allows the company to continue to improve its DPO while the supplier gets his DSO optimized. An option is actually, in the present context, and considering that most companies don't generate much profits, it's a moment eventually to stop the area of expenditure which are not necessary for the operation of an organization. So contract suspension and cancellation, at least for a period of time, can be a good option. While we look at the balance sheets of an organization, there is one specific element that a CPO can act on, and that's actually the value of the inventory that you have. So the inventory, if you talk to your finance people, constitutes a risk to them, and that's a risk that needs to be financed. So there are many options that can be adopted in order to mitigate eventually the impact of a high inventory on a balance sheet. The first one is eventually to push that onto your supplier's balance sheet by introducing vendor managed inventory. So rather than you having the inventory sitting on your shelves, they are at your suppliers and your suppliers deliver as and when you require. You can also have consignment stock, which is pretty much a system similar to this one. But the principle here is actually to see how you can impact, now that we have spoken about the P&L and we looked at the cost of the contract, the total cost of a contract, how you can now act on the balance sheet and make sure that all the improvement that you bring to your organization are extremely helpful. Finally, and again, these are just a few examples, but there are many other activities that we've carried out and eventually that I assume other procurement function could have carried out eventually to cope with the pandemic. there is an opportunity clearly in the current context to consolidate contract and eventually to diversify the scope that you give to some of your key vendors. This allows eventually to benefit from economies of scales, but it also allows your supplier to continue having the level of revenues that will help them to survive. And it's quite important if the intention is to keep a sustainable and resilient supply chain. So, having said that, and once you have understood eventually what are the key levers that you can work on, you need to understand eventually what does the future look like. And if I take the specific example of the aviation industry, there's at least 6 crisis exit scenarios that we had to take into consideration. And I believe they are not only linked to the aviation industry, but as a whole, they are probably the same for all different industries. So if you look at 2020, we started the year with a growth rate which was a trend, growth trend which was pretty stable. The intention was the outlook was that the aviation industry will continue to grow, there wouldn't be any problem, and then we'll be on a straight line all the way to 10.3. Then we had this drop in 2020, and one of the scenario of exit of crisis is to have actually a V-shape recovery scenario. The next one is actually a U-shape. So the idea here is that we had a drop in 2020, we're going to slightly recover slowly throughout 2021, and then there will be a parallel between the expected, the forecasted growth and the current growth. Finally, and the one which is most likely to happen is actually to have an extended U-shape where the recovery will be slow throughout 2021, and then there will be a stabilization between 2022 and 2023. So the first scenario has probably 10% of chances of happening, and I think given the situation we are in at the moment, where the vaccines took a bit more time than expected to come, it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. There are a few other options that have been considered by most of the experts, one of them being eventually to have an L-shaped scenario whereby we would have a long recovery. The W scenario is in the case where eventually we're expecting a standard recovery and then eventually another wave of coronavirus, but which would be as important as the one we had previously in March. And the last one is actually L and the W scenario. But I'll focus here on the two most important, which are the U and the extended U-shaped scenario, which are the most likely eventually to happen. And the reason why it is important to understand this crisis exit scenario is simply because without an understanding of this potential scenario, it is extremely difficult to prepare for the recovery and to build a plan that will allow the company to grow or to recover on the long run, and eventually to recover the same level of profits and cash flow generation. So once we have identified these two scenarios, the real question is how to prepare for the recovery. And there are a few things that I would highlight here and that I would eventually recommend you to look at. The first thing is actually to understand the possibilities that you have in your hand to use your supplier base as a competitive advantage. So most of the suppliers are trying now to innovate and to prepare for the future, so 2021 and after. And each and every single supplier should be used as a key competitive advantage, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of innovation. It's important to develop strong relationship, strong understanding of the supply needs and economics. So what I mean by that is quite often as procurement and supply chain professional, We tend to look at our interests, we tend to look at how our company works, what we expect to get from the company, but we forget sometimes to put ourselves in the shoes of the suppliers. And unless we understand the supplier needs and economics, need in terms of financials, but also the economic outlook of the supplier, it's extremely difficult to have a clear plan and to define the realistic target that can be achieved with this specific supplier. I've seen a lot of organizations where people have transactional relationship with suppliers, and I think in order to get out of this crisis, it's very, very important to focus on supplier relationship management and build strategic partnership promoting innovation. So whatever innovation that you have in your mind and whatever innovation that your company wants to drive needs to be discussed with your suppliers in order to make sure that through a strategic partnership, both companies can work together and build a long and sustainable partnership that will be extremely helpful for the resilience. We have in our specific case, and I encourage everybody to build flexibility into the contract to allow for continuous improvement and eliminate waste across the supply chain. So I was referring earlier to total cost of ownership. There are ways eventually to look at the vendor buyback when it comes to the waste that you have in your supply chain. So that will help you eventually to avoid to have slow moving and obsolete inventory sitting in your supply chain. These are elements that need to be included into the contract. By continuous improvement, I mean that it's not a contract shouldn't be looked at as a standard document that sits there and doesn't evolve. There should be elements in our contract and incentives for continuous improvement. It's quite important from my perspective, eventually, to systematize the make or buy analysis when negotiating contract. So typically, as much as possible, trying to outsource the non-critical streams of activities and eventually see how you can optimize the cost. I truly believe that a company cannot be specialized in everything. So there are some areas where your company is a specialist organization, but there are some areas where a supplier knows potentially better than you. And when it comes to this specific stream of work, looking at make versus buy and eventually trying to buy rather than doing it yourself will help eventually to optimize the cost base. Beyond the contracting process and beyond all the contracts that are set with suppliers, all this strategy can only succeed if there is the right governance model in place. And this governance model should need to be at each and every single level of an organization. So based on my experience, what I've always seen is that there are some specific strategic contracts that need executive involvement. And the appropriate governance level is for the direction to be given by the executive and the regular review process to be set so each and every single level across the organization is involved into the development and the improvement of the contract. One of the things I missed earlier, and it's quite important to me to specify is that, especially considering the importance of understanding the financial of an organization, is actually to develop a solid spend management framework with your finance. This is the only way that any procurement organization will be able to demonstrate the impact of the savings they generate on the P&L. So I'm sure that a lot of people in the room have heard the sentence, you know, where are the savings? These are theoretical savings and so on. Once you understand the budgeting process, the financing needs of your organization, the financing process, the cost base of the company as a whole, it's much easier to identify savings and to build a savings guideline which is aligned with the that you agree with the finance team, and therefore allows you to demonstrate the value of your organization. To me, if someone is in an organization where the value of procurement wasn't recognized, the crisis came pretty much as a blessing. And I know it's controversial what I'm saying here, but typically what I want to highlight is that through this crisis, we had an opportunity eventually to demonstrate all the value we can bring to an organization. We should seek for opportunities to offload assets and inventory from the balance sheet. So we spoke about the introduction of vendor managed inventory and consignment stock. So that's pretty much sits in the same seat. And finally, one of the recommendations that I would give is to increase the expenditure side of requirements and to control maverick spend. So obviously in a period of recovery, there is no company that can allow itself eventually for non-required expenditure. And that requires an important element of control that can be introduced through the revision of the procurement and supply chain policy. So I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope this presentation has been helpful for most of the people online, and I'm now more than happy to listen to your potential questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go to questions because we're beyond our time limit now for this particular session. But thank you for your presentation and thank you for explaining, your thought processes. That closes our keynotes track. We now have a number of other tracks that are due to start soon. So in our roundtables track, starting right now, is an interactive discussion called e-procurement, just an added functionality or a necessity, and you're all welcome to join this. At 1:45, UAE time, it is in the strengthening supply chains track. We will have a talk on orchestrating analytics to create value, given by Patrick Ditzley from software company SAS. In the innovation highway track at 2 p.m. will be a live talk entitled Just Do It Procurement, given by Waleed Al Saidi from the Department of Tourism and Culture, Abu Dhabi. Also starting at 2 p.m, but in the new supplier relationship management track, will be a panel discussion on strengthening supplier relationships in today's business environment.